Okay, so this is the 3-day weekend crowd. Like I always like to say in church, this is how I know who doesn't have a house out of town. Anyway, I'm so happy that you're all here, and what a treat we have today and next Sunday both. We have Jacob Bender, who is an independent filmmaker and an interfaith consultant who has traveled the world on the quest and question of interfaith relations. And it was soon after 9/11 that Jacob, who's an American, grew up in Los Angeles, a Jewish man, reached out to the Muslim community for dialogue to begin to bridge the gaping gap that happened in the post-9/11 world here. And it was after that that Jacob began to be sought out by conferences on religious dialogue. He spoke for 3 years in Doha at the religious conference in Qatar. This is something where you may remember Rabbi Douglas Krantz also was a speaker there. He's spoken in mosques around the world. He's spoken in Egypt and was also part of the UN Alliance of Civilizations Forum, and then also at the opening ceremony of the King Abdullah Interreligious Center in Vienna. He is published all over the place, from the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, International Herald. It goes on European, Middle Eastern newspapers, articles around, and he is also one of the leading voices of the question of the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian issues. American voices in this, that is, and he's going to speak next week about that. But this week he's going to be speaking about some of the film work that he has done, an interreligious dialogue that he's done. And in a moment we're going to take a look at a trailer of his film, which is known as Out of Cordoba, and I'm going to let Jacob introduce that to you. Jacob, you missed a lot of your introduction, but I can tell you it was awesome. Anyway, here he is, Jacob Bender. Welcome.
I'm sure I learned new stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Good morning. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times?" And Jesus answered, "I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. A few centuries later, the Talmud, the great compilation of post-biblical Jewish wisdom, records the words of Rabbi Hama, a 3rd century sage, who says, "Great is repentance, for it brings healing to the world." Father Walsh, members of St. Mark's Episcopal Church, dear friends, it is an honor for me to visit New Canaan this morning and to share the story of my labors in the gardens of interfaith relations. And how appropriate that I am speaking to you in the town of New Canaan, a name whose provenance recalls the twin biblical themes of forgiveness and repentance, values that are the subjects of my talk to you this morning. As many artists and storytellers, I know of no other way to begin than with the story of the self, an attempt to explain, to elucidate how I, an American Jew, became enraptured with the traditions of first Christianity and then Islam, and how this tripartite spirituality, this Trinitarian tradition of the children of Abraham, dominated my life and led to the making of my film Out of Cordoba. In my beginning, my parents hated religion. They were socialists and they hated religion. My grandparents on both sides of my family had come to America with the great wave of Eastern European Jews streaming into Ellis Island in the early years of the 20th century. Like hundreds of thousands of other Russian Jews, they suffered religious oppression at the hands of the Tsar's police, and once in America, packed into the stinking tenements and sweatshops of New York's Lower East Side, They suffered the economic oppression of industrial capitalism. In this world, religion, specifically the religion of Orthodox Judaism, with its hatred of modernity, its denigration of political action, and its authoritarian rabbis dressed in medieval garb, offered no hope to my grandparents. Rather, my grandparents found their hope in the new secular religion of socialism, with its Messiah, Karl Marx, looking surprisingly like a modern-day Moses, leading the workers of the world out of the Egypt of capitalist oppression into the socialist promised land of a classless workers' society. My family referred to our small, secular, religion-hating, left-wing Jewish community as a minority within a minority. I was sent 2 afternoons a week to an afternoon school where I learned Yiddish, the vanishing language of the vanishing Jewish proletariat, and where I was taught a restricted version of Jewish identity, which favored revolution over ritual and class struggle over creed. Being a teenager in the 1960s, my own rather peculiar form of revolt against my parents took the form of an explicit rejection of their secular anti-religious worldview, and this rejection led directly to my discovery, then immersion in the hitherto unknown world, for me at least, of Jewish spirituality. At around the same time, I fell in love with the movies, especially great historical dramas of heroes and clashing armies that Hollywood loved to turn out. For me, there was no more exciting era than ancient Judea, when the Jewish people first fought the Greeks for their religious freedom, a battle immortalized in the holiday of Hanukkah, and then culminating in the great Jewish revolts against Roman occupation, first in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, and then again in 135. I still remember to this day going by myself as a kid to Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard to see the great epics Ben-Hur, King of Kings, and The Greatest Story Ever Told. It was through these 3 films that I first discovered and came face to face with something or someone missing from my Jewish education, and that was the figure, the person of Jesus. Within a short time, but still in my teens, I came to the conclusion that the story and mystery of Jesus, long a source, perhaps the source, of division between Jews and Christians, was in fact the key to the reconciliation of our 2 communities, helping to overcome centuries of mutual mistrust and misunderstanding. I was not the first Jew to enter into a deep connection with the figure of Jesus, a first-century rabbi and religious reformer, faced with the violence-imbued opposition of Judea's Roman overlords and their Jewish ruling class quislings. In the 20th century, many Jews could be found among the ranks of the world's leading New Testament scholars, among them Joseph Klausner, Giza Vermes, David Flussner, and today the Jewish scholar Amy Jill Levine, and in Berkeley, Jonathan Boyarin, a great Talmud scholar, whose most recent book is called The Jewish Gospels. In his book, Professor Boyarin argues that the coming of the Messiah was fully imagined in the ancient Jewish text, and that many Jews in first century Judea embraced Jesus as this person. Most startlingly, perhaps, to both many Jews and Christians, Boyarin argues that all of what we find in the core teachings of Jesus and in the synoptic tradition, from the divinity of the Messiah to the utilization of the messianic title, the Son of Man, to the belief in the resurrection, to the concept of the Trinity, all of this can be found in many places in the culture of first century Palestinian Jewish life. And to find an artistic Jewish attraction to the figure of Jesus, we have only to look at the series of paintings by Marc Chagall, perhaps the most famous Jewish artist of the last century, which depicts the crucifixion of Jesus. when I become transfixed while looking at these paintings, or become still when listening to the unfathomable opening measures of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, I am drawn back to the themes of forgiveness and reconciliation. A few days ago, I heard a story on NPR about the 50th anniversary of a famous speech by then Alabama Governor George Wallace on the steps of the state capitol, in which he declared, and perhaps many of you recall this as well, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. The NPR story included an interview with civil rights hero Representative John Lewis, who recalled that Wallace, in the last years of his life, crippled from an assassin's bullet, called on Lewis to ask forgiveness for his racist past. When questioned by the NPR interviewer if he indeed offered forgiveness to Wallace, Lewis said that as a Christian he must do so, but also as a Christian he must not forget. This same spirit of forgiveness and repentance can also be found in the struggle of Bishop Desmond Tutu and the people of color of South Africa to end their oppression at the hands of a white minority committed to protecting their privilege at all costs. Surely the presence of Jesus was felt as well in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which helped transition South Africa from apartheid to democracy. When Jesus answered his questioner, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times, you must forgive those who trespass against you, he was telling us that there is also no limit to forgiveness, and that therefore there's also no limit to repentance. This same spirit of forgiveness can be found in the life and writings of the great Jewish philosopher Martin Buber, a figure of transcendent importance to Christian-Jewish relations. I will have more to say next week about Buber's importance to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but here's a story about Buber's life that mirrors my own deep involvement in the complexities and tragedies of German-Jewish relations. After World War II, Martin Buber was offered a prize called the Peace Prize by the Frankfurt book publishers in the annual Frankfurt Book Fair in 1949, and he decided to go to Germany, one of the first Israelis to go back to Germany after World War II. And there was much criticism of Buber in the Israeli press for daring to go back to Germany so close after the war. But Buber went, and it was part of his engagement in the act of repentance, in trying to reconnect with what was decent and good still within the German nation. Perhaps these words, this action of Buber, also expresses his own understanding of forgiveness and repentance. I constantly thought about Martin Buber when my own personal life became forever entwined with Germany and its legacy of genocide. In 1999, I married Katharina, a German citizen doing a doctorate in modern Jewish history in New York, not your usual career choice for young German women. Katharina was born in Stuttgart into an upper middle class Protestant family, and like many post-war Germans who learned about the enormity of the crimes of her parents' generation, she became infused with a sense of national and even personal guilt. This led Katharina, hardly alone, to begin a course of studies in Jewish history at Heidelberg University in Germany. One day, when she returned home to visit her mother in Stuttgart, her mother told her to sit down and said, "I have something to tell you about our family." It was thus that Katharina, at age 22, learned that her grandfather was Jewish and that her mother had to be hid in a Catholic monastery during the war because the family lacked Aryan papers, and that the only reason none of Katharina's many aunts and her grandfather, who was Jewish, of course, and her grandmother, who was not, survived the war was because the sisters of Katharina's grandmother, who was a Christian, the one married to the Jewish grandfather, were themselves married to high SS officials, and it was they who protected their German family, their German Jewish relatives. I had to confront all this history when Katerina and I decided to get married. Not only the question of becoming an interfaith household, but also how I, as a Jew, would relate to my father-in-law, to my new father-in-law, who had served in the Wehrmacht, the German army, even though he had been drafted into the army at the terrifyingly young age of 14 in 1944, as the Nazi regime was running out of cannon fodder to throw at the advancing Red Army on the Eastern Front. When I lived in Israel in the early 1970s, I spent 3 years working at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, which left me, of course, with an indelible impression and understanding of the tragedy of Jewish life in Europe during World War II. And it was this that I had to face when entering into this marriage with a German of Jewish and Christian lineage. Dalia Rosa, the daughter of myself and Katerina, was born in 2001, and we utilized her middle name as a homage, as a memory to Rosa Parks. 5 months later, on that cloudless late summer morning, Katerina and I were pushing Dalia in her stroller around the great lawn in Central Park when we saw a plane flying surprisingly low overhead, its wings violently rocking back and forth like this. We had never seen anything like that, and so we went home, turned on the TV, and the rest, as they say, is history. We sat transfixed in front of our TV screen, watching our fellow human beings as they fell to earth, watching the towers as they crumbled. Near the television, Dalia lay on her back on the floor, smiling up at the mobile above her, unable to comprehend the horror in front of her, unable to understand the delusions and illusions of hate-filled fanatics who called themselves Muslims. Faith in the service of oppression. My parents and my grandparents would have seen 9/11 and as a vindication of their hatred of religion. But would they have been correct? Is religion in our world a force of division, a justification for terror and occupation and oppression? Or is our presence here today and the existence of thousands of others around the country who daily, monthly, and yearly work in the orchards of interfaith relations proof that the spiritual wisdom of our ancestors can yet contribute to a world that chooses tolerance over terror, human rights over human persecution, liberation over occupation, and love over hate? Katerina now works in an amazing organization in New York as the director of operations for an organization called September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. Perhaps some of you have heard of this organization. It is made up of 350 families, all of whom lost loved ones on 9/11 in the towers, on the planes, in the Pentagon, in the fields of Pennsylvania. And 2 to 3 years after 9/11, these families found each other somehow and joined an organization to say that they did not want the memory of their loved ones to be used as sources of war and hatred and terror, but as a source of reconciliation and forgiveness. Each of us responds to tragedy in our own way. We bring our own individual backgrounds, our values, our loves, and our fears to each action in our lives. My own life has rested upon two foundations: the spirituality, the wisdom, and the comfort I found in the shared traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and my work as an artist and a filmmaker. I therefore resolved in the days after 9/11 to combine these two foundations in a film that would explore our collective Jewish, Muslim, and Christian past as a way to irrigate the interfaith garden in our own shattered time. But where to start? I had long been fascinated by the history of Al-Andalus, the centuries of Muslim rule in Spain, and I, along with many others, had come to see this golden age of Spain as a beacon of tolerance that could shed a much-needed brilliance upon our own dark times. The first post-9/11 book to explore this theme was by Yale professor down the road, Maria Rosa Menechal, and is called The Ornament of the World: How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain. Here's a quote. In the Muslim city of Cordoba, street lighting emblazoned the nights, and the city was home to hundreds of libraries, mosques, and synagogues and gardens. Here, Muslim and Jewish scholars excelled in philosophy, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, poetry, theology, and numerous other fields of human endeavor. Medieval Christian travelers visited Cordoba in amazement, writing accounts of her many wonders. And for a time, Cordoba was the most advanced city on the entire European continent. Sadly, Professor Menechal died a few months ago. There is a very large memorial a couple months ago held at Yale in her honor. Cordoba was also the birthplace of two of the greatest thinkers of the Middle Ages, the Muslim Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, and Moses Maimonides, the Latinized name of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimun, the most important Jewish thinker of the last 2,000 years. They are two of the shining lights of Al-Andalus, and it quickly became apparent to me that they should be the subject of my documentary film, not only because they represent the zenith of Islamic civilization in Iberia, but also because their defense of rational philosophy also brought them condemnation from within their own religious communities. Their condemnation by their co-religionists also helps us to refute the ahistorical nature of the so-called clash of civilizations thesis. For what we are really facing, I believe, is not a clash between civilizations, but a clash within civilizations, between those committed to a hate-filled, xenophobic worldview of extremism and those who believe that their respective religious traditions mandate a commitment to peace, justice, forgiveness, repentance, and love. Little did I know when I began work on Out of Cordoba that my work on the film would become a mirror image of Al-Andalus, of Muslim Spain itself, and its value of what the Spanish call convivencia, which is how the Spanish refer to the concept of religious coexistence. For in making Out of Cordoba, I could never have done the film without the financial and emotional support that I, as an American Jew, found in the Christian and Muslim community around the world. First and foremost, there was my mentor on the project, Father David Burrell, professor of theology and philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. And I should say every good Jewish boy from Manhattan should have a Catholic priest as a father confessor. Father Burrell is an internationally known scholar and has written greatly of St. Thomas Aquinas' debt and understanding of Islamic and Jewish philosophy in general, and specifically to his understanding and his influence by Maimonides and Averroes, especially in his understanding of Aristotle. Expanding upon this understanding of Aquinas to the entire relationship between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism in the Middle Ages, Father David has written in one of his books, already by the 13th century, the notion of God and religion in the West was an interfaith affair. This is an amazing statement, one that, if understood properly, can begin to reorder our basic understanding of both our past and our present. It is also a statement that exists at the heart of my film Out of Cordoba, an artistic attempt to demonstrate that Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all together make up the fabric of Western civilization. When I began my film, working on it, of course, I needed to do fundraising right away because I came with zero money to make the film, not being related to Spielberg or other great names in Hollywood. And I shortly thereafterwards started putting things on the internet and was quickly adopted in a way by an organization called ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, the largest mainstream umbrella Muslim organization in the country. And they began to send me around to mosques and Muslim conventions to talk about my project, both as a way to increase interfaith understanding, but also quite honestly as a way to try to raise money for the film. And this brought me into direct contact with Muslim organizations around the world. And I found myself invited beginning in 2006 to 4 annual trips to the country of Qatar and its capital city of Doha for their annual interfaith conference run by an organization called the Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue. During my 2006 trip, I was interviewed on the Al Jazeera program in Washington, and when I came back and told my mother this, she said, "Great, now 200 million Arabs now know what your face looks like." And then in 2007, I got to my office and opened up my email. And of course, I had been writing many grant proposals since 2003. And the email said, His Royal Highness Prince Al-Walid bin Talal is happy to donate $250,000 to your film. You don't get emails like this every day, not specifically from the richest man in Saudi Arabia, and certainly not as an American Jew receiving such a large grant from the richest man, part of the royal family. But I think it was in all humbleness a testament to my steadfastness in trying to get the film off the ground, but also to the recognition of the prince that Muslims around the world had a debt to pay because of the rise of terrorism coming from extremists in the Muslim community, and had to do all they could to salvage the understanding of Islam within the West, but in a way also to make amends for what their extremist co-religionists had engaged in. Of course, there were many people, public intellectuals, some clustered around the Bush administration, who found all Muslims suspect of being extremists and terrorists. One of them was a professor by the name of Daniel Pipes in Washington, and he has a website called Jihad Watch, which, when it became public knowledge that I had received this large grant from Prince Al-Walid, put out a page on his website saying that this is no surprise because Jacob Bender is a long-time member of the Saudi secret police. Now, I thought, needing more money to finish the film, that I should take that page and go to the Saudi embassy and said, I've been accused of being on your payroll. Could we make it an actual fact at this point? Because I could use a good salary and more, but I didn't do that. So beginning in 2006, I began doing filming around the world, and this led me to Spain, Morocco, France, Italy, Egypt, Palestine, Israel, and Greece. And then in January 2009, I was the only American Jew invited to Egypt to attend and speak at a conference on Muslim-West relations at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the major seat of Sunni learning in the entire Muslim world. My speech at Al-Azhar in January 2009 happened to fall exactly during that Israeli war in Gaza. And in criticizing that attack, my speech was widely covered in both the Egyptian print and broadcast media. Out of Cordoba was completed in March 2010, and the film had its world premiere in April 2010 at the Amnesty International Arts Festival in Washington, D.C. The film has since been screened over 100 times at film festivals, interfaith conferences, universities, mosques, churches, and synagogues around the world. And perhaps most excitingly, Al Jazeera has bought the film and is doing an Arabic version of the film, which will literally be seen by another potentially hundreds of millions of people around the Middle East and North Africa. In interacting with Muslims around the world, I learned much about Islam, and I learned about a quote in the Quran which goes like this: "For every one of you, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we have appointed a path and a way. If Allah had willed, He would have made you but one religion, one community. But that He has not done, in order that He may try you in what has come to you. So compete with another in good works." So compete with one another in doing good works. Some 800 years after they lived, Averroes the Muslim, Moses Maimonides the Jew, and Thomas Aquinas the Christian can still all enter our hearts and our minds if we let them, and help us as we compete with one another in doing good works. Their words and their life stories can both inform and inspire us about some of the greatest issues confronting us at the beginning of our new century: the relationship between religion and state, between faith and science, between reason and revelation, the dangers of political extremism, and the courage it often takes to oppose injustice and search for truth. By reading and interpreting their writings and the times in which they lived, we can discover that we Muslims, we Jews, and we Christians are all B'nai Avraham, Ibna Ibrahim, the children of Abraham. We can discover that in the struggle to create a more just and peaceful world, we may perhaps have more in common with those in other traditions who share our values of forgiveness, reconciliation, and justice than we have with the more extreme followers within our own religious communities. Again, thank you, and it's a great honor to be here with you this morning. Thank you. And now my trailer for the film, which is 8 minutes. The entire film is 80 minutes, and I hope one day to be able to show it to you in its entirety.
As our new century dawns in terror and war, many have concluded that religion leads inevitably to hatred and violence, and that we are witnesses to a clash of civilizations. Others, however, dream of that long-ago time in Andalusia, Spain, when the city of Cordoba was an oasis of religious tolerance.
Salam alaikum, shalom aleichem. I am most honored to speak to you today as a Jew and an American in this magnificent city of Cordoba, a place where once long ago Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived together in peace.
The medieval civilization of Muslim Spain, known in Arabic as Al-Andalus, reached its peak with two controversial geniuses born in Cordoba: Averroes, a Muslim, and Maimonides, a Jew, each courageously attempting to balance the often competing demands of reason and revelation, faith and science. Conflicts still haunting us at the beginning of our new century.
The attack that bright September morning destroyed not only human beings and buildings. Because I had spent over 3 decades promoting dialogue among Jews, Christians, and Muslims, as well as working for peace between Israel and her Arab neighbors, 9/11 challenged the core beliefs of my life. Attempting to recover my belief in the possibility of interfaith coexistence, I embarked on a journey retracing the footsteps of Averroes and Maimonides in Spain, Morocco, Paris, Venice, Egypt, Palestine, and Israel. Along the way, I would meet Muslims, Jews, and Christians who, like the 2 wise men of Cordoba before them, are courageously working to hold back the surging tides of extremism and intolerance in our own troubled times. In his audio tapes, Osama bin Laden constantly refers to the loss of Muslim control over Al-Andalus, the Arabic name for Spain, as a tragedy. How do you understand his reference to Al-Andalus?
Bin Laden uses Al-Andalus as his example of the tragedy of Al-Andalus, but he, of course, understands Al-Andalus in a radically different way from the way that you and I understand it. He doesn't understand Al-Andalus as the land where Muslims, in fact, created a culture of tolerance.
Sí, bueno, es una expresión en mi despacho, que es el lugar más íntimo de trabajo y de reflexión de un ministro de Asuntos Exteriores. He querido traer los dos retratos de los 2 grandes filósofos y pensadores, judío y musulmán, Averroes y Maimónides, como expresión de lo que debe ser el trabajo de la diplomacia.
Parler de choc des civilisations ou de choc des religions ou de fatalité de la confrontation entre juifs et arabo-musulmans est une escroquerie. Il n'y a pas de choc des civilisations, il y a un choc des ignorances.
Dans l'histoire, il y a eu des moments de rencontre et que nous avons aujourd'hui à privilégier ces moments-là, à les rappeler pour pouvoir justement dire que le refus de l'autre n'est pas une fatalité.
I would say that no figure in Venice probably gives us a better idea of what the real Averroes looked like than this 14th century sculpture of a North African or Egyptian judge of Islamic law, which of course is what Averroes was. But the Venetians dealt with people like this, with their huge official turban, and so such an official with whom the Venetians negotiated is the one who is represented right here.
Which again shows the close connection between Venice and the Muslim world.
The connection was so close that it is no exaggeration to say that basically the Doge of Venice and the Sultan of Cairo were existential allies.
false starts and shattered hopes, is peace between Arabs and Jews still possible? Is there indeed a clash of civilizations between the West and the Muslim world? Does religious belief, as some argue today, lead inevitably to hatred and violence? Suspended between doubt and belief, between skepticism and spirituality, Out of Cordoba is an attempt to explore the questions that have come to define our age.
I'm only cutting that off, Jacob, just because we only have a few more moments.
Okay.
If you have a word or two for a minute or two, and then a question.
No questions right away. Yes.
This week it's exploded in the news what the president of Egypt has said regarding Jews. What is your take on what's going on there?
25 words or less.
Repeat that question.
The question is, there is a report of a anti-Semitic speech with very prejudicial anti-Jewish language made by President Morsi a couple years ago when he was a high-ranking member of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt during the time when Mubarak was still in power. So my immediate reaction to that, of course, it was terrible and disgraceful, and there's no way of excusing language like that. He has since made an apology or a way to explain that away, whether it was an apology or a half-hearted attempt at public relations. Remains an open question. And I will talk more about this next week when we concentrate on Israel and Palestine. But it's clear that the whole relationship between Muslims and Jews, between Israel and Palestine, between Jews and Arabs, cannot be separated from the political tragedy and the political conflict between Israel and Palestine, which has lasted the last century, which has been now slightly over a century. So that colors it. It's not a way of saying that there's any justification for language or racist thoughts like that, but it's a way to say that it's a very complicated question and that it can't be separated from the sense of hurt that exists on both sides of the divide between Jews and Muslims, between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. Yes, in the back.
How should Muslims deal with the rather large number of anti-Jewish and anti-Christian folks in the
many people have pointed out that there has, yet to be a reform movement within Islam, as there was a Reformation in Christianity and a reform and conservative movement which began to question in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries the Orthodox hold for within my religious community, but there is an attempt to say within certain parts of the Muslim world that I have come into contact with, in a way harkening back to Averroes, who quite clearly said that if the Quran was contradicted by Aristotle and by human observation of the natural world, then the Quran should be understood as a metaphor, not as a literal truth. Now, this was said by a Spanish Muslim philosopher 800 years ago. And I think one of the reasons that there has been a reinterest in Averroes and the idea of Muslim rational philosophy around the Muslim world today is precisely because of that foresight expressed during the Middle Ages. But I try to, when I speak in synagogues quite often, I try to remind my audience who ask similar questions that when you look at Deuteronomy, there are quotes that talk about when Joshua came in to the land of Canaan, you shall kill their women and their children and their goats and raid their farms and destroy their crops. So my Jewish tradition says that we have choices to be made as human beings. And part of that choice, those choices we face, is how to deal with what one rabbi friend of mine calls the texts of terror. And within the Quran, there are quotes like you refer to, but there are also quotes that I read to you, that Allah ordained that there should be peoples of different religions so that we can compete with one another in doing mitzvot, in doing good works. And so again, we come back to the question of choice. And that's a short answer to a long question.
That was a great answer. One more question and then we're done. Okay?
Yes.
One more, please.
I'd like to ask you if the people who gave you the money asked you to include or exclude anything from the documentary.
Not a thing. And one of the things I try to respond to, now I was never faced with that, and one of the things I tried to respond to people who accused me of taking, the prince's money from Saudi Arabia, I said, my mother also gave me money. If you think the Saudis are dangerous, you haven't met my mother yet. And one last story, and hopefully all of you will come back next week, is that when I began the film, I was wanting to do it as a standard sort of PBS documentary with off-camera, what's called the voice of God in documentary filmmaking. And then my producer and editor said, it's not working. You can't tell the story of these two rather obscure philosophers from the Middle Ages without a personal story attached to it. And I said, well, that's an interesting idea. Who did you have in mind? And they said, well, you, meaning me. And I sort of recoiled in horror, not wanting to see myself in the film or on camera, and thinking that I would become known as the Jewish but slightly thinner version of Michael Moore. But I sort of gave in to the idea, and in truth be told, and I referred to this in my talk, it sort of worked in the end because, again, the story of making the film for me was a collaboration of Jews, Christians, and Muslims from around the world and working collaboratively on this project. And in a way, it felt many times that we were reliving the convivencia, the coexistence that we found in some periods of time in medieval Spain. And it's also the sense of wonder and optimism and hope that I find in taking the film and speaking to Christians, Jews, and Muslims around the United States and in places around the world. So again, it's been a great honor to be here with you in New Canaan, and I hope to see you next week. So God bless.
Well done. Well done.